briefest of introductions. I'm literally going to say, can we please welcome Justyn Rees Larcombe? Thank you.
Love it. That's all we needed. Afternoon. Thank you so much for the lovely welcome. You'll be pleased to know that I haven't come to preach a long sermon to you. I'm not going to baffle you with lots of PowerPoint slides. I want to share my story, and the story has a theme of light mixed in with it. And did you see that light yesterday afternoon? Wasn't it crystal clear and beautiful? We haven't really seen much summer or much spring, so yesterday was lovely. This little book features, and so does the story of my lovely mum, Justyn Rees Larcombe, who went to glory in October last year. And I want to just say that Alex was very, very special to my mum, and they had a lovely bond. And it means a lot when I hear her talking about my mum, because if truth be told, I do miss her quite a bit. Let me just start off with reading a verse. I always think it's quite good if you start off with something from the Bible. And Living Light, some of you may have seen this. It's just a day-by-day guide with a few verses on a theme in the morning and a few verses on a theme in the evening. And the verse I want to read is from John chapter 8, verse 12. Very simply, I am the light of the world. So if you follow me, you won't be stumbling through the darkness, for living light will flood your path. I came to know my Creator from a very early age. I had to make my own decision on that because coming from a big family, I had five brothers and sisters, and parents who had a very strong faith. So I needed to make my own decision about that, but that was fine. I had a very special relationship with Christ as I was growing up, and my ambition was to be in the army. Actually, I wanted to fly. I wanted to be a helicopter pilot, and when I finished my school, I was taken off to officer training. The army were going to be mad enough to try and teach me to fly, but first I needed to do my officer training. And when I turned up at Sandhurst at the Royal Military Academy on my first day, my mum leant over and she said, "There's something I want you to have." And she wrote in the very front of it, and let me just read to you, just a snippet here. She was aware that sometimes I wouldn't have time to read my Bible in the morning, so she gave me this living light, and she said this. She said, often you won't have time to read the Bible, so we thought that you might like this. It might help. Armies may march on their stomachs, but spiritual food gets you even further. As an officer, you'll be responsible for the lives of your soldiers, but as a Christian, you'll be responsible for their souls. And I love that. And I continued to live my life in the light. What do I mean by that? Well, I really mean that I had a very open and honest relationship about my belief in Christ. I was willing to talk about it. If there were habits that I had, I dealt with them by being very honest with my Creator and actually honest with myself. And by reading the Bible, going along to church, and having that regular relationship with the Lord. And I call that living in the light. And actually at Sandhurst, very early on, I had a chance to talk about my faith with the senior officers within Sandhurst, because within the first week was the rugby trial, and I loved rugby. And there was a note to say, if you get selected for the first 15, you get all day Wednesday of training. So we all volunteered for the rugby trial, and because there were so many of us, we had to have two. The first one was on a Saturday, and those who played well were selected for the second rugby trial on the Sunday. I thought overnight on Saturday night, I don't want to play rugby on Sunday. I want to go to chapel. So I plucked up the courage and I went to see the colonel who was in charge of rugby, and I said, I can't play in the rugby trial today. I'm a Christian and I want to go to church. And he smiled at me, and I wasn't selected to play in the first 15. I was a reserve. But the person who was playing in my position got injured very quickly, and I went on after about 2 minutes and played the best game of rugby I've ever played. Within 2 weeks, that same colonel had invited me to be the captain of the Academy First 15, which was a real honour. And I think actually the general at Sandhurst, who loved his rugby, must have only known my name through his connection with enjoying rugby, because at the time when we came to graduate, all 420 in my intake, he had to choose who graduated top and would be awarded the Queen's Sword of Honour. And he chose me. And my mum came up and saw me that day when I got awarded the Sword of Honour. So my career in the army started well, but it didn't all go to plan. I discovered that although I could fly, I couldn't actually land aeroplanes. So I had to find another career within the army. So I joined another regiment. But I love the army. And the reason I love the army so much is, if I tell you, there are elements of my character that came to bite me a little bit later in my life. I was a thrill seeker. I was always looking for the next thing, the next promotion, the next course. I was never really happy in the here and now. I was incredibly competitive, and the army taught me never to give up. If something blocks your pathway and you want to do that, find a way around it. And those are not great traits, if I tell you, for someone who gambles. You might understand a little bit why later in this story I got myself into so much trouble. I was promoted very quickly in the army. I volunteered for everything. I did parachute training, I did commando training. For a couple of months was the youngest major in the British Army, and everything was going well. And then I went on an operational tour to Bosnia at the end of the 90s and saw some pretty horrible things, some results of ethnic cleansing. And I don't think I ever really dealt with those. I went on leave after my tour, and rather than talking to someone about it and sharing my experiences, which is what happens now in the armed forces, I bottled everything up. And a friend of mine was working in London. He'd left the army a couple of years before, and he said, "Why do you work so hard? You don't get paid very much. You have to work weekends. You go on operational tours for 6 months. You get no time off. Why don't you come and work in the city?" Without really even thinking about it, when I got back to my regiment, I went to see my colonel and I resigned my commission. But rather than going into a well-paid job in the city, I actually went to the very bottom of the pile. I knew nothing about business. I knew nothing about financial services, but I was very ambitious. I wanted to catch up. I was still living in the light, still putting God at the very heart of everything I did, putting him first in everything. And sometimes I'd stay in the office after everyone else had left at 5 o'clock till 9 o'clock at night. And the only people left in the office at 9 o'clock at night would be the cleaning company and the managing director. And sometimes the boss would come over and say, "Justyn, what are you still doing at your desk? It's 9 o'clock at night." And I said, "Well, I'm trying to catch up." There were 18-year-old, 19-year-olds so much better at this than I was. I'm doing my exams. Within 2 years of leaving the military, I had been promoted. I was one of the youngest directors of a division of a global financial services company, working in the city, earning a 6-figure salary. I'd bought my own house. I'd married the girl of my dreams. We had nice cars, nice holidays. We had a lovely son. There was another one on the way. Everything on the outside looked good. But on the inside, there was a fundamental problem. You see, I'd said to God, "Thank you so much. You give me all I need. I'll take it from here." And we lived up in Derbyshire, and I had to commute down to London. It was a long journey there and back. And I kind of said, "Well, there's no good churches up here, and I haven't really got time for a quiet time anyway. And I've got all I need." And I didn't stop believing in God. I just pushed him away. I said, "Thanks very much. I'll take it on." And that was a big mistake. Things started to happen. I'm going to go through this bit quite quickly now. And some of it actually is still a bit emotional for me. I noticed that Matthew was our 11-month-old son. He wasn't using his right hand for anything. And I had really thought about this for a long time. Emma said, no, it's okay. My wife, she said, he's just going to be left-handed like other people in my family. And then I heard a radio interview, and it was with a retired footballer talking about how he'd noticed his daughter, 11 months old, wasn't using her right hand. She got a diagnosis for a form of cerebral palsy called right side hemiplegia, and it basically meant she'd had a stroke as she was being born, had no dexterity in her right hand, and very limited movement down her right side. That night, I said to Emma, please, come on, let's just take Matthew to see someone. Rule things out. We very quickly realized that Matthew had an issue. Got called in to see the consultant. He'd had a scan, and she put up a three-dimensional computer image of Matthew's brain, and it had a great big scar on it. She said he's always going to have that limited movement. And by the way, he may well go on to develop epilepsy. Just a week later, he was in my arms, this 11-month-old boy, really lethargic. He had a temperature, and his right arm started to jerk. I knew what was happening. I thought, he's having a fit, but I didn't know what to do. And I did everything wrong. It was a febrile fit caused by a very sharp peak in his temperature. Should have laid him down, loosened off his clothing, let him cool down. I didn't. I cuddled him up, and I tried to talk him out of having the fit. We put him in the car to take him to the hospital. That was stupid too. There was loads of traffic, so we drove back to the house, called the emergency services, and Matthew had turned blue. He was still fitting, and by now he wasn't breathing. And I put my head against his, like they taught me in the army, my cheek against his face to see if I could feel any breathing. I couldn't feel anything. His lips turned purple. And at that stage, I did something I hadn't done for months. I prayed. Just a simple prayer. I said, God, please help. I don't want to lose my son. And pretty much immediately, round the corner came my next door neighbor, who was a retired surgeon. He stepped in and took over, and continued to give him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. The ambulance came, took him away, gave him a drug that pulled him out of that fit, and he was okay, but I wasn't. I think the trauma of that triggered some things that I'd seen earlier, and I was in a really bad way. My wife, on the other hand, was great. She got online and looked at what it would mean. I, on the other hand, was watching a game of rugby, something I'd done 1,000 times before, but this time I noticed an advert for a £5 free bet. I got my laptop and put my £5 down that I needed, and I won. And I often wondered what would have happened if I'd lost that bet. But I won, and I didn't tell Emma. I didn't feel right. And I felt excited. And actually, to be honest with you, I was pretty bored with life. That commute down to London and back was ripping out my soul. 3 hours on a train every day. They promoted me, which meant I wasn't doing sales anymore. I was managing people, which was really quite boring. It paid me well, but I had no thrill. I stopped playing rugby a few years before. Suddenly, I found something that gave me a bit of a buzz. And I went chasing it. I told my boss I didn't need to come into London every day. It's not being very productive to you sitting on a train for all that time. Why don't I come into the office once a week and I'll work from home? I used to do my work in 2 hours, and the rest of the day would stretch out ahead of me. I began to gamble more frequently, more often. I had access to money. Emma often would go off and work, and I would be left at home. And then one day I realized I wasn't very good at gambling, and I actually calculated that I'd lost money, not won it. Now, I'm an incredibly bad loser. What I said was, okay, I'll stop. But first, I'll just win that money back. And I put £1,000 down on a tennis match, and I'd never spent that much money before. I was shaking when I put that bet on. And I lost. If I'd won all that money back, I could have just closed down my account, or so I said to myself. And the first thing I did is I phoned up my bank, I arranged an overdraft, and I put another £1,000 on the next tennis match. Now I was chasing my losses. Now there was a hole in my finances. Now there was a chance that my wife might find out that this person who was really good at business and giving them a secure future was actually living a double life. Because I was lying. For the first time, I began to pretend that rather than working in the evening to prepare a presentation when the US markets started, I was actually gambling on the most bizarre types of sports I could think of. Romanian second division football, virtual horse racing. I was sucked in. I'm going to go really fast here because there isn't time to dwell on it, but it was a horrible, horrible time. There were 3 years where I went from having everything to losing the whole lot. I kept it a secret. We sold our house because Emma could see I wasn't happy. And the only reason I wasn't happy is because I was having these massive mood swings. When I was winning, I was okay. When I was losing, I was down in the dumps. I withdrew as a father. We'd had another son. And rather than being a hands-on dad, which is what I love to do, and I don't mind any nappy. Well, maybe not every nappy. But I was hands-on, and at this time, I hid away. I hid away in my room. I could hear them splashing away in the bathroom, and I'd be there on my computer, desperate to try and win this money back, desperate that no one would find out what I'd done. Because when we sold the house, I put the money from the sale into my own account, not to Emma's. And we moved into a rental property, and we looked for somewhere to live. And over, Emma would find the perfect house. And then I'd dash her hopes by saying, we can't move there. The garden's too big, it's too small, there's no good schools, it's too close to a main road. And actually, the reality was I'd spent all the money that we had from the sale of our house. And by now I was borrowing. Because I was worried if I'd stopped doing what I'd been doing before, if I suddenly stopped having these holidays, if I stopped getting the children what they would, if I'd stopped running my car, Emma would have said, well, what's wrong? What's going on financially? And she'd have asked me questions that I would have found very difficult to answer. And so I lied and I borrowed. If I press the fast forward button now to the time when I knew I had a problem, I'd tell you about a time when Matthew wanted me to go to the swings with him. He was perhaps 3 years old. He said, Daddy, please take me to the swings. We were down at my in-laws' house. It was raining outside. We'd had lunch. And at the end of lunch, Matthew said again, Daddy, please take me to the swings. So Emma said, go on, take him. But can you go home first and get his coat? So I drove back a couple of miles to our house and I stopped the car. Matthew was strapped in the front. I walked in, put my hand on the coat and remembered that morning I'd placed a bet. I thought, I'll just go upstairs and check my account, make sure the money's gone in, and then everything will be fine. I can just focus on Matthew. But I'd lost, and I remember feeling angry. I thought I'd just go to the roulette table, the online casino, which is terrible. Smartphone technology is horrendous nowadays for young people particularly. It's so easy. 2.5 hours later, I'd emptied out my bank account again. I went downstairs, and Matthew had cried himself to sleep. The tears he'd cried were dried in lines on his cheeks. But rather than putting my hand up and talking to Emma, rather than seeking help, I hid it all up. It was my own stupid pride. I said, I'm the one that's got myself into this mess. I need to get myself out of it. It was a classic. Forget the light, I'd rather live in the darkness, because I'm pretty disgusted with this habit. But if I don't tell anyone, it's okay. I don't have to admit it. Emma found out I lost my job. I'd used a corporate card that I had to only use for expenses. I got called into the office at work, and they said to me, someone's cloned your card. There's £27,500 worth of gambling transactions. It's fraudulent. We'll need to get you a new card. It's going to take a few days. And I said, they're not fraudulent, they're my own. I went back and I lied to Emma. I said that I'd left that job and I got a better one to go to. She found out, rather than me telling her, and this is so important because trust is so, so special. If ever you have a habit that you're hiding away, please talk to someone about it. Be honest with yourself. If you have a faith in Christ, you are so, so, so blessed. Because he's there to help, never promising us that life will be easy, but promising us a way out, a support when we need it the most. Emma found out we had friends to stay, and they found a bank statement they showed her. And actually for a while I stopped, and then I had an email from another company saying, oh, have a free £50 bet. And I said, that's okay, that's not gambling, it's a free bet. And I was just back in my old ways again. This time Emma could see. One morning I woke up, and she'd left. She'd taken the children with her. And she was right to go, because I was in self-destruction mode. When she went, I began selling the things in my house. I even sold my sword of honor, the most special thing that I own, the most precious. And I cried when I walked out of the shop, because that bit of metal had meant everything to me. I was living off a sack of moldy potatoes, imagining what impact it might have on my children if I just wasn't there anymore. real dark times. To talk about light, the opposite was dark. It was November. It got dark earlier. When I'd spent my money, I just used to go to bed and try and just close down. Then there was a knock at the door. It was my lovely mum. She said, I've heard about what's happened. Your father-in-law has spoken to me, and he's paid off your arrears. I had 5 months rent arrears. You can walk the streets because you're going to be evicted on Monday, or you can come back to Kent and try and find some recovery. She didn't judge me. She didn't say, you need to do this and we need to do that, and you need to go and get that treatment. Actually, when there is an addiction or a secret habit or a compulsive habit, the individual is the one that needs to deal with it and come to their own rock bottom. And then they can take control and start finding. You can never heal for an addict, even though you want to, and you see the destruction that it's causing. You have to let them find their own pace. I went back home to Mum. I had 3 sacks of possessions, black bin liners of stuff, £73,000 worth of debt, no job, no car, no family anymore. And I got down on my knees and I prayed a proper prayer. The same kind of prayer when I first became a Christian. I asked God to forgive me. I asked Christ to come back into my heart. And I asked him if he could mend me. He did. Last time I ever placed a bet was November in 2012. And it was on the morning of that day when I got down on my knees. It wasn't easy. And people often ask, well, how did you do it? And I love it. Because if I go on TV or radio and it's live, I'll tell them, it was my faith in Christ and he really helped me. If it's pre-record, then often they'll edit that back out and then they'll ask me again. So how did you find... Anyway, being open about it was really good. Being able to tell people. Being able to bring something that I kept in the darkness out into the light. Then it got dealt with. And I went along to some meetings and I talked to some people who could help, people who'd been in a similar situation. I sorted the debt out. People take their lives because of gambling addiction in this country at a horrible rate. You don't hear about it. You just hear that there's been a suicide. They don't ask why. It could be because of debt issues. But lift a bit more, you might find that they've stolen from a charity. Lift a little bit more because there's a gambling addiction. I'm part of the Royal Society for Public Health Steering Committee on Gambling Addiction. That's a bit of a mouthful. But we look at a lot of the research that's going on. And they found that if you have a problem with gambling, you're 10 times more likely to take your own life in this country. And 25% of every suicide in the UK is gambling related. And it's our young people now that are being exposed to it. It's our young people that are most adept at smartphone technology. I wanted to do something about that. When I felt I was ready, I'd found a bit of recovery, I wanted to do something about that. And I went along to Gamblers Anonymous, but at any of the anonymous fellowships now, you mustn't talk about God. You have to talk about a higher power or a God of your own understanding. And I'm not knocking the anonymous fellowships. I think they're fantastic and they've helped many people. The 12-step program is a recognition that addiction is a malady of the soul. You can't recover on your own. Back in the 1930s, the 12 steps were designed by 2 Christian pastors out in America. And so I decided that I'd get together with some friends and we'd look at a course up in London that was being run, which put Christ back into recovery. And the Recovery Course charity now is a charity that enables churches to run their own recovery courses. And you know what? When I go and talk in churches and I say, I run a course for those who have compulsions or addictions, and the families of those people who've been affected by the addict, I generally find that the response is, oh, that's okay, we're a church, we don't have any addicts here. And if we're really honest about this, and we think about all of those things that impact us, and actually it was lovely we had a bit of prayer time in the prayer room before tonight's service, and it was just so lovely to have a discussion about, you know what, we all carry these things, and these habits, these compulsions, these secret things that we do, whatever they might be, they block our relationship with Christ. So if we're talking about light, imagine a great big dark cloud had come across the sky yesterday afternoon, blocking out the sun. It would have been pretty miserable, wouldn't it? For me, my addiction blocked out my relationship with Christ. And when I sat down and said, I'm sorry, I want forgiveness, that cloud left me and I began to live in the light. There's so much more I could do and to talk about this, but I'm conscious that I want to hand this time back now for people maybe who've been challenged to think, well, you know, maybe I do use things to cover up the pain that I carry. Maybe I do drink a little bit too much. Maybe I do eat a little bit too much. Maybe I do buy things I don't necessarily need because it makes me feel better. All of those little things that we don't need to be ashamed of because we're human. But we feel bad about ourselves after. And when we start feeling bad about ourselves, that makes it very difficult to feel that love and that forgiveness that I have to tell you I felt when I sat down, when I got down on my knees and I prayed. I didn't feel judged, even though I'd really mucked my life up. We need to get rid of those clouds and be forgiven, because who are we to judge ourselves when we've been forgiven by the ultimate judge of all? And that's what I'd love us to work on maybe a little bit when we come into that time. Let's not be angry with ourselves. When we do those things, recognize that perhaps they're not healthy. There's some practical things you can do, but also some very spiritual things you can do if you do have a relationship with Christ. And if you don't, or you know anyone who maybe has a habit that's bringing them down or bringing their families down, maybe a good chance to just talk to them, have that conversation. Wonderful things happened. My debt got paid off. I got another job. I began to share my story with radio, with TV, which is actually really hard to stand up and say, hi everyone, I'm an absolute idiot, this is what I've done. But actually it also was a very honest thing to do and reach people. There's a huge stigma with gambling addiction. Very few people want to admit it. Because it basically says, I destroyed my life, I lied, I stole things, I mucked up my finances, and it didn't just hurt me, it hurt my wife, it hurt my husband, it hurt my parents, my children, relationships destroyed, marriages gone, jobs lost, people going to prison, people taking their own lives. It's miserable, but there is hope, and the hope comes from living in the light. When I was finding recovery, one of the things I wanted to do, and this is the last story, I'm going to end here. By the way, if you do want to talk to me, please come up afterwards. I will even devalue a book if you want to buy one. I've written one for Christians and one for non-Christians. Just come and talk to me. But I wanted to give something back. So I decided I was going to swim the channel. So I started training. And on the day finally came when I was going to swim solo across from a beach between Folkestone and Dover, across towards Calais, across the two busiest shipping lanes in the world, 33 kilometers in a straight line, and you never go in a straight line because of the tides. And I said to my pilot, that was my guide, a boat that was going to give me feeds every 2 hours, was going to navigate me safely through the shipping lanes, was going to get me to the other side. I said to him, give me one bit of encouragement, one thing I can do that I can hold on to as I swim. And he looked at me and he said, Justyn, all you've got to do is stay close to the boat and I'll get you across. And for the first 10 hours, everything was fine. And then something terrible happened. I saw France. And I suddenly thought, hey, I've nearly made this. Look, I know where I'm going now. I'll just go in a straight line for the nearest point of the coast. And as I did that, it began to get dark. The wind picked up. The waves started crashing in. As I turned my head to breathe in the darkness, I couldn't see the waves coming. I was gulping salty water. My throat was raw. My shoulders started to ache with all the waves, and the wind was blowing me. And me going in a straight line, I thought I was hitting France. I was heading off towards Belgium. And my pilot kept saying, come back to the boat. Come back over here. What he was trying to do is he was offsetting our route because he knew the tides. And he was trying to get me around the back of a little bit of France that sticks out, Cap Grenay, and so that when the tide changed again, I'd hit land. But me going in a straight line meant I was basically doing that. But I thought I knew best, even though he'd been doing it for 27 years. And then eventually he shone this great big light, a searchlight, by the side of the boat where I'd been swimming all day. And I thought, he wants me to swim there. I don't know why, because that's in the opposite direction than France, but I'll do it. And when I got there, I got shelter from the wind in the lee of the boat. They gave me a triple strength feed. And in the light, now I could see the waves when they were coming. They didn't stop, but I could see them. And I ducked, and I stopped taking on that salt water. And 2 hours later, we hit France. And as I got on the boat back to the UK, I thought, that's a bit like my life. When I go off thinking I know where I'm going in the right direction, doing my own thing, things go drastically wrong. But when I'm living my life in the light, I've got a guide that can take me through. Not to say the wind won't come, but things are so much better. And I want to leave it there, maybe with a little challenge. For those of you who have something, secret habit, whatever it might be, or know someone who might, be honest. Talk to them. Be honest with yourself. Don't condemn yourself, but just let the light of Christ flood your life, and you'll see that pathway, just like that verse I read from John. Thank you for listening.